From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. Hundreds of thousands of Nicaraguans joined celebrations marking the 39th anniversary of the Sandinista Revolution. It was on July 19, 1979, when the revolutionary troops entered Managua, defeating the Somoza dictatorship. This year, the country faces some particular political obstacles, as the government and people have confronted violence and attempts to destabilize the government. The largest gathering took place at the Plaza de Fe, where President Daniel Ortega addressed supporters, calling on the country to defend peace and reinstate the unity that existed in the nation before violent opposition protests broke out in April.
This coup was being organized. We could see that happening. They knew it would be difficult to carry out with all the stability in Nicaragua, the 11 years of stability. You've had 11 years of economic growth, education, roads for the people, homes for the people, but we did it. We worked on programs for the people, for the campesinos, for the cities. And we did this with never-seen-before popularity rates, very high levels. They didn't want to see us continue the revolution, to strengthen the revolution. And it was obvious that the revolution brought peace. It was obvious that it had brought security.
Exuberant crowds came out for a major show of Sandinismo in support of the government just one day after the OAS voted to condemn Ortega. And though this was a celebration, President Ortega spoke about the way in which a coup attempt unfolded over the last 3 months. The former FSLN commander was joined by ministers from Cuba, Venezuela, and El Salvador, who came to take part in the commemoration.
Our decisions are not made in Washington, but in Nicaragua. It is us who have to defend our participation, to defend this model, which continues to support peace and reconciliation, because we will never be the promoters of hate. We are against all of this violence that has done so much damage to the people. We do not hate them. The protesters, we call on them to change. Help them to change so as to play a productive part in building peace in our country. We want promoters of peace, not people of death.
Venezuela's Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza also spoke at the rally and brought the solidarity of the Venezuelan people.
The Sandinista front has had to face imperialism many times, and many times they have won. 2018 won't be an exception. The Sandinista people of Nicaragua will be victorious again. We understand this because we also lived the same experiences you've lived in the last months. A year ago, our country saw violence in what we call the Guarimbas, terrorist forces financed by North American imperialism, supported by businessmen, the oligarchy, and the church. They tried to defeat President Nicolas Maduro, but President Maduro, just like Ortega, was able to apply the concept of strategic patience and achieve the victory of peace.
And for more on the celebrations in Nicaragua, we are joined by human rights and labor lawyer Dan Kovalik, who joins us from Managua, where he attended yesterday's massive rally. Hello, Dan. What did you make of the celebrations yesterday?
Well, it was amazing. It was incredibly spirited. The entire plaza was full of people. I was told maybe 100,000 people, which is a large crowd, especially given the fact they did not bring people in from other departments. They were only people from Managua. There had been attacks by right-wing opposition on caravans over the last months, so they did not try to get people in from other departments. But it was amazingly spirited, very exciting. People were happy. It was a huge celebration.
And a lot of what we've seen on mainstream media about Nicaragua would have us thinking that much of the traditional Sandinista base has left the side of the government. But based on your time there, is this the case? How strong is the support for the government?
Actually, it's my impression, and what I've been told is that, frankly, people are now rallying around the government. Daniel Ortega, even after this 3-month crisis, now has a 50% approval rating. And one of the popular songs that we heard incessantly throughout our trip is Daniel se queda, Daniel stays. And people have realized that this, in the past 3 months, that there has been a huge propaganda and misinformation campaign against the government. And they realize that it is the Sandinistas and that it's the police who are protecting them, and that they have been victimized by these really criminal elements that have wreaked destruction these past 3 months.
So you're currently there as a journalist investigating the facts that happened the past weeks. What is your opinion on what's happening, or your facts, your investigation so far?
Well, again, I mean, it's very clear to me that what the government has been claiming, that this was a soft coup, although not that soft, it was pretty hard actually, that it was a soft coup, that this was a well-orchestrated plan to overthrow the government, and that in terms of violence, the lion's share of the violence came from these right-wing opposition, who used criminal elements to terrorize the population over the last 3 months. They've been killing Sandinista activists, in fact, in some areas, marking their homes to show they were Sandinistas, targeting them for threats, for assassination. They've been killing police, setting up these roadblocks where they harass people, sometimes beat people up, in some cases even rape people. And so, meanwhile, the economy has been trashed by these right-wing forces. It's quite sad. They've gone after credit unions and other institutions that provide help to the poor. And again, people now realize that this was a reactionary campaign against the government and the people.
We've been hearing about a fire in a radio station. Have you heard anything about this?
Yes, well, we visited this radio station. It's Radio Job, the most popular radio station in Nicaragua, and it's the most popular left-wing station in Latin America. And they were, their building was set on fire while they were in it by these right-wing, opponents of the government. 22 people were inside, including a pregnant woman. Thank goodness they got out alive, but the entire radio station was destroyed, and they're now operating out of a makeshift radio station. And this is an example of what's been happening over the last 3 months.
A critical time indeed. Thank you very much, Dan, for your time.
Thank you.
We're speaking to Dan Kovalik, human rights attorney. Now to Colombia. Members of the newly elected Congress will take up their seats for the first time in the next few hours, with the parties on the right in the majority. So let's take a look at how those seats in Congress are distributed. We're looking at a percentage of the representation of the division right now. There are 280 seats in all, 108 in the Senate and 172 in the lower house. These numbers indicate how many seats go to each party. We can see, for example, on the right in light blue, that the Centro Democrático Party of the former president Álvaro Uribe and the incoming president Iván Duque is the largest party in Congress, with 19 seats in the Senate and 32 in the lower house. And of course, as a result of the peace agreement reached in Havana, the FARC is present in the Congress for the first time with 5 seats in each house. The new National Congress will face substantial challenges in improving the lives of Colombians. Some of them will include reforms to health, justice, political and tax systems. But the main challenge will be the legislation around reconciliation and peace.
Consolidating the peace agreements was one of the difficulties faced by the previous Congress and will be a historic challenge for the coming one.
The challenges are absolutely linked to peace in Colombia, especially with the president and all the managers that will be in charge. We will strengthen the projects that will guarantee the enforcement of the agreements.
It was always said that the victims were the core of the agreements, but when it came down to the moment of justice, Congress denied them the opportunity.
We must wait to see how this new Congress and government behave regarding this project, but we will continue the struggle from the National Congress for justice for the victims.
Violence hasn't stopped, even after the peace agreement. 130 social leaders have been killed. The protection measures have failed. However, the government insists in not legitimizing campesino, indigenous and cimarrona vigils, which could prevent murders of region leaders.
The ruling must start by giving communities resources to regulate and protect themselves. In fact, in the case of Afro-descendant communities, we've already said that we'll work to get the cimarrona vigils recognized and also the tools to enforce their rights so they have integral protection.
Another challenge that some Congress members will have is fighting against free trade agreements that directly affect the campesino development. Also, to formalize the continuation of it, considering that this caused the armed conflict.
Here in Colombia, around 70% of campesinos live on their land. We work the fields, but we don't own them. We have no property papers, and now they are violating our rights by developing a new controlling agency and by taking the resources of municipal judges. So the challenge is to give the lands to campesinos, which would reduce the war significantly.
Another huge challenge will be to implement anti-corruption systems if the Colombian people vote for it. On July 20th, Colombians will watch as 280 Congress members take office in Bogotá. We'll see if they work for war or for peace for Colombia.
And in Brazil, a caravan in support of Lula da Silva has been delivering a message of hope for all Brazilians that have been affected by Temer's policies. Our correspondent, Andre Vieira, has a story.
We are here in Pernambuco for the Landless Workers Movement caravan being held to support former President Lula da Silva. This is a march largely made of farmers and those who work in agriculture, but is also joined by professors and people of other professions. This march is not only in support of former President Lula da Silva, but is also meant to deliver a message of hope for the Brazilians who have been affected by the policies of Michel Temer. People that are part of this march want to tell the world that an election without Lula is a fraud and that he is indeed a political prisoner.
Andre Vieira from Brazil. Now we'll take a short break, but join us again after a video of our multimedia team.
It's not your fault.
Welcome back. Thousands of Peruvians took to the streets again on Thursday night to protest against corruption in the judicial system. The protesters marched in Lima and other cities, some of them carrying effigies of rats and vultures to symbolize the corruption and abuse of power among the country's judges and in other institutions. In the last 2 weeks, a series of recordings have come to light which seem to show judges arranging bribes on behalf of criminals and businessmen.
Once again, we Peruvian citizens come out to say enough to the impunity and corruption in the justice system, which has been taken over by absolutely corrupt and infamous administrators.
This protest is one of indignation before a serious act of mega corruption, of a metastasis that our beloved country is suffering, that is harming the political, social and economic life of the most humble homes of our beloved Peru. That's why today all the Peruvian people, the Patriotic Front, the Union Confederations, all of us have taken to the streets to protest through the length and breadth of our country.
The protests came just hours after the head of Peru's National Council of Magistrates, which oversees judges and prosecutors, stepped down over the influence peddling scandal. 2 others on the 7-member panel joined him, and later in the day, the president of Peru's judiciary, Duberly Rodriguez, also tendered his resignation.
There is a justice system that is supposed to be reformed. There is a president of the republic desperate to be removed. Very radical, probably motivated by being mentioned in those audios. His weapon is to say, well, I am very radical, and the audios don't have anything to do with me. It's not that way.
Mapuche leaders in Chile have been protesting outside the Supreme Court to demand that the trial of their colleagues in the Luchsinger-Macay case may be overturned. The protesters want the Mapuche activists José and Luis Tralcal freed. They say their sentences to life imprisonment were full of irregularities. Before this case came to court, the only person charged had been Machi Celestino Córdoba. The director of the International Monetary Fund, Christine Lagarde, is expected to meet Argentina's President Mauricio Macri in Buenos Aires this Friday. The country's largest union is rejecting the country's agreement with the IMF, saying that no good has ever come from going to the IMF. As part of the deal, Argentina lowered its primary deficit target to 1.3% of GDP in 2019, down from 2.2% previously. Around 90 social and environmental organizations in El Salvador have mobilized to reject the privatization of water resources. The FMLN party is promoting reform of the general water law in opposition to the current proposals that only benefit corporations. Activists have several concerns since the proposed law would limit access to water resources to just 35% of the population. In Honduras, the nationwide strike continues as drivers demand a reduction of gas prices.
The strike continues here in the capital city of Tegucigalpa and in cities across the country. This includes users of inner-city transportation and drivers of mass transit and taxis. Here in the capital city alone, there are 30 points that have been blocked by buses and taxis. Their drivers demand a response from the government over gas prices. They say they will not accept a price increase, but instead demand a price reduction. The price has now reached $4 a gallon for regular gas.
That was Gilda Silvestrucci from Tegucigalpa. Pesticides in Brazil have killed hundreds, and more than 13,000 people a year are poisoned by them. A new report found that chemicals are sprayed near schools and neighborhoods throughout the rural areas of the country without any safety guidelines. Let's hear it from Mia Alberti.
Hugo Diaz still has headaches and still attends physical care regularly after the school he teaches at was sprayed with pesticides. The incident happened 5 years ago in the state of Goiás, in the heart of Brazil. Him and more than 90 children were affected, and 5 years on, no one has been held accountable.
When we were sprayed, the children's mouths started turning numb, their eyes and hands irritated. Years later, many kids still feel this, and even I do. I almost died. I smelled death. And I see that as years go by, we're just some more victims of the pesticides.
Just last year, more than 13,000 people were poisoned by pesticides in Brazil, and almost 500 have died. But the number is expected to be much higher accounting for the people who do not come forward. Lili Marmori is a doctor who works with affected communities daily, and she has seen many cases of intoxication, but also several cases of chronic poisoning. Cancer, depression, and even suicide are some of the consequences.
We've seen an exaggerated increase in cases of cancer, mainly in people living in rural areas. Depression, fogginess, even leading to cases of suicide.
Pesticide intoxication is a nationwide problem. The chemicals are sprayed near homes, schools, affecting entire communities, while authorities fail to respond, according to a Human Rights Watch report. Rural communities are almost entirely dependent on the surrounding agribusinesses. That means affected population struggle to come forward, afraid of reprisals.
Many of the landowners of those plantations are very wealthy, they may be politically quite powerful, and the people who are experiencing these poisonings are absolutely fearful of speaking out and telling what's happening to them. And that fear is well-founded in many cases. We were able to document cases of threats as a retaliation for raising the concerns around pesticides.
Brazil is one of the world's largest users of pesticides, but some of the chemicals used here are banned in other regions like Europe. The Ministry of Health told Telesur it has a program in place to help health workers and communities lower the risk of exposure. The Ministry of Agriculture, in charge of controlling the use of pesticides, did not comment in time for this report. The subject of pesticides has been a very difficult and controversial debate here in Brazil for years now, and it's about to get even more difficult. By the end of this year, Congress is going to vote on a bill to change the laws regarding pesticides, and this bill has been deemed by some as the poison package by its critics, but it's also heavily supported by the Rule Bench, which is a group in Congress made of lawmakers that are related to the agribusinesses, and they are expected to pressure the bill into being accepted. Mia Alberti, Telesur in São Paulo.
We'll take one final short break, but join us again after a video from our multimedia team.
Ils veulent pas d'image.
Thanks for joining us again. Now let's have a look at some other stories making headlines around the world.
The White House has said that President Donald Trump plans to invite Russian President Vladimir Putin to Washington this autumn. The news comes 4 days after their summit in Helsinki that led to an uproar in the country over Trump's failure to denounce Putin for allegedly Moscow's meddling in the 2016 US election. The last time Putin went on official visit to the US was 11 years ago. Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that there are forces in the US which are damaging Russia-US ties following the summit with President Trump. He also said that the relations between the two countries were by some parameters worse than during the Cold War.
We see that there are forces in the US that put their narrow group interests and party interests higher than national ones. Russia is open to developing contacts with the US on the basis of equality and mutual benefit.
Chinese President Xi Jinping is on a 3-day official visit to United Arab Emirates. He was welcomed by the UAE Vice President and Prime Minister Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. It is the first visit to the country by a Chinese head of state in nearly 3 decades. They will be discussing the enhancement of their bilateral ties, trade deals and oil cooperation. Former South Korean President Park Geun-hye, who was convicted in April on charges of corruption and abuse of power, has been given 8 more years in prison on top of her current 24-year jail term. The new sentence is for illegally accepting funds from the country's spy agency and for interfering in elections. 66-year-old Park, country's first female president, was impeached last year.
An artist in Manhattan has placed an installation near a public park which depicts a mother and a child locked inside a black metal cage, separated from one another. Artist Marilyn Miller used mannequins representing a migrant mother and a child dressed in gray shirts with messages that say, "Mommy, where are you?" and "They took my child." The art installation is a response to US President Donald Trump and his zero-tolerance immigration policy, which led to the separation of hundreds of immigrant children from their parents. And with that, we come to the end of this news brief. But this and other stories, as you know, you can find on our website at telesurtv.net/English. And be sure to also follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.
Quiero señalar frente a ustedes lo que es la